Nobody expected it to go this far. Dan Goldman walked into that hearing room with a specific document in hand. And the moment he placed it on the table in front of Todd Blanche, something shifted. Because what Goldman had wasn't speculation. It wasn't a theory. It was a file. An actual FBI document. And according to Goldman, it proved something the Department of Justice had been quietly denying for months. Blanche sat across from him, composed, measured, the kind of calm that comes from years of high-stakes legal work. He had survived Trump's criminal trials. He had navigated the most politically charged courtrooms in the country. But this was different. This wasn't a courtroom. This was Congress. And Goldman wasn't defending a client. He was demanding answers. The exchange started with a simple question. Had Blanche reviewed the FD302 documents currently in DOJ possession? The ones detailing victim testimony from the 2019 Southern District of New York investigation? The ones that, according to multiple survivors, contain the names of at least 20 men Jeffrey Epstein allegedly trafficked victims to? Blanche's answer was careful, measured, the kind of answer that sounds complete until you listen again. He said the files had been reviewed, that multiple administrations had examined the same materials, that there was no credible information warranting new indictments. Goldman didn't accept it, because here's what Goldman knew that the room didn't yet fully grasp. The documents sitting inside the DOJ aren't just case files. They are, according to investigators who worked the New York case directly, some of the most detailed victim testimony ever collected in a federal sex trafficking investigation. Women who cooperated with the FBI. Women who described specific men, specific locations, specific patterns of behavior. All of it documented in official federal records. So when Blanche said there was nothing credible to pursue, Goldman did something that changed the entire atmosphere of the hearing. He pulled out the document. Not a summary, not a press release, the actual filing, and he read directly from it. The room didn't move, because what Goldman read wasn't vague. It wasn't redacted talking points. It was a direct reference to FBI records containing names. Names of individuals identified by more than one victim. Names that the DOJ had never publicly released. Names that, according to Goldman, were being protected by a system of redactions so aggressive that even members of Congress with oversight authority couldn't access the underlying information. And that's the moment Blanche's composure shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly to most people watching. But Goldman caught it. And the cameras caught Goldman catching it. Blanche attempted to redirect. He referenced legal constraints. He mentioned ongoing investigative protocols. He noted that releasing names without formal charges creates legal exposure for the department. Goldman came back harder. He pointed out that the DOJ had already released documents in a chaotic and incomplete manner. That victim names had been accidentally exposed without redaction in a previous document dump. That a document labeled Child Sex Trafficking Co-Conspirators had been so heavily blacked out that even clicking through the official DOJ portal led to more redactions layered on top of existing redactions. If the department was so careful about protecting identities, Goldman asked, how did survivor names end up publicly exposed in the first place? And if the redactions were so thorough, why could experienced investigators find nothing useful when they pulled the files? Blanche had no clean answer. Because there isn't one. The problem at the center of this entire confrontation isn't partisan. It isn't about which administration is protecting whom. It's structural. It's about a system that has repeatedly applied one standard of transparency to ordinary citizens and an entirely different standard when the names involved carry global influence. Think about what Goldman was actually arguing. Not that Blanche personally covered something up. Not that the current DOJ leadership had acted in bad faith. But that the institution itself had been designed, over years and across multiple administrations, to make certain names disappear. To bury them inside a machinery of legal process so thick that no single hearing, no single congressman, no single disclosure obligation could cut through it in real time. That's the architecture Goldman was attacking. And Blanche was sitting at the table as its representative. The exchange escalated when Goldman introduced a second document. This one addressed something that had surfaced weeks earlier from a Commerce Secretary interview. A claim that Epstein wasn't merely a trafficker but potentially the operator of one of the largest blackmail networks in modern history. That what happened in certain private rooms may have been recorded. That those recordings, if they existed, could have been used as leverage against extraordinarily powerful people. Goldman asked directly, has the DOJ interviewed the official who made those public statements? Blanche said no. Goldman pressed, Did the DOJ plan to? The answer was indirect. If the individual wished to speak with investigators, the channel was open. Goldman's response was quiet but precise. In a case involving one of the most documented criminal networks in recent history, the Department of Justice was apparently waiting for witnesses to volunteer information rather than pursuing leads. He didn't need to say it louder. The room understood exactly what he meant. And then Goldman did what the best congressional questioners do at the exact right moment. He stopped pressing on Blanche directly and turned toward the documents themselves. He introduced the first batch of unread FD302 forms into the record. Pages almost entirely blacked out. He described navigating the official DOJ portal looking for the redacted names and finding, behind each hidden section, another redaction. A black box behind a black box. Information about information that itself had been removed. He introduced a witness statement that cross-referenced names already appearing in other parts of the document production but missing from this specific file. The kind of inconsistency that either indicates a mistake or reveals something about which name someone decided required extra protection. He introduced the reported list of individuals who had distanced themselves from their positions around the time of the most recent document releases. Not as proof of anything, but as a pattern worth noting. And finally, Goldman introduced something that cut through every technical legal argument Blanche had offered. A letter. Written not by Goldman. Not by a victim advocate. Written by Attorney General Pam Bondi herself to FBI Director Kash Patel. A letter in which Bondi expressed frustration that certain files were not being fully disclosed to her own office. Let that land. The Attorney General of the United States, writing to the FBI Director, urging him to stop withholding documents. Inside the same administration. Inside the same department nominally responsible for handling the Epstein files transparently. Goldman placed it on the record and let the silence do the work. Because this wasn't about Democrats versus Republicans anymore. This wasn't about one hearing or one official's credibility. This was about an institution so large and so compartmentalized that its own leadership couldn't get a straight answer about what was inside its own files. Blanche's final responses were procedurally correct. He noted proper channels. He emphasized ongoing review. He reiterated the position that no new credible information had emerged that would justify reopening formal investigations. But Goldman's point wasn't about this specific moment. It was about the 20 years before it. In 2006, prosecutors in Florida were told to stand down. In 2008, a non-prosecution agreement was quietly arranged without informing the victims. In 2019, the case was reopened and Epstein was arrested. Weeks later, he was dead. The security cameras weren't working. The guards were asleep. The official ruling was suicide. The independent forensic expert who examined the body said the physical evidence was more consistent with homicide. And through all of that, every single administration, Republican and Democrat, reviewed the same files. And every single administration concluded there was nothing credible enough to pursue. Goldman wasn't accusing Blanche of being the architect of that system. He was pointing out that Blanche was now responsible for maintaining it, and that every non-answer, every procedural deflection, every reference to prior review, was itself a choice. A choice to leave the same doors closed that had been closed for 2 decades. When the hearing finally moved toward adjournment and members began shuffling toward the exit, Goldman remained seated for a moment longer than most, looking at the documents still spread across the table. The files were still there. The names were still hidden. The 302s were still redacted. And somewhere inside a federal archive, behind firewalls and classification codes and legal privilege claims, the full story of what Jeffrey Epstein did and who he did it with and who knew and when they knew it remained sealed from public view. The hearing didn't break the case open. Hearings rarely do. But something happened in that room that doesn't happen often enough. A man with documents sat across from a man with institutional authority and refused to accept the standard answer. He named what he saw. He entered it into the record. He made the deflection visible. And visibility, in cases like this, is the only currency that matters. Because the Epstein files don't stay buried because of one bad actor.